I like how Marvel is taking full advantage of its access to Disney licenses and integrating classics into their serious Marvel films. Whedon took that song from Pinocchio and made it super creepy. What am I talking about? Pinocchio was already creepy. The following is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before listening to this review. I've always been amused by one-dimensional, cartoonish villains who can't seem to decide if they want to rule the world or blow it up. And I've talked about that a lot on Superhero Rewind. Characters like Ivan Ooze in the first Power Rangers movie are just generically evil and like destruction. They're just there because superhero stories need a colorful threat, and in a black and white good versus evil story, the motivation of the representation of badness hardly needs a well-considered motivation. Avengers Age of Ultron, of course, is not that kind of story. It's about the shades of gray, villains who see themselves as heroes, and heroes who, despite their best intentions, might cause more problems than they solve. Joss Whedon suggests in his commentary that one of our main heroes, Tony Stark, is the villain of this piece, albeit one who is redeemed by the end. Age of Ultron builds on the idea in its predecessor that the good guys may not always be working toward the greater good, and that unchecked power is dangerous in anyone's hands. But not only does this movie include the most complex and interesting version of the villain who kinda wants to rule the world and kinda wants to destroy it in Ultron, because in this case he can't see the difference between saving humanity and destroying it, but it offers a superhero equivalent to the same paradox. Do the Avengers want to help people, or do they want to save the world? Those are very different things, but we use them as interchangeably as we do ruling and destroying in a lot of these stories. Helping people is reactive, but saving the world is bigger. That implies you only act when there's a threat to the entire planet, or else you're working towards something more permanent, something preemptive, which is what Tony wants to do when he and Bruce Banner create Ultron. Peace in our time. A blanket solution to a new problem that maybe the Avengers can't always solve. Threats from abroad, i.e. beyond our planet. Our heroes came together last movie to stop one clear and present threat, but beyond that, they have difficulty agreeing amongst them what exactly the mission is. Is it to fight evil in whatever form it may take, tirelessly and selflessly giving of yourself until you have no more to give, the Captain America side of the equation, or is it to fight in the short term, but create a way long term to eventually get out, live a life, be a human being, as Tony learned in Iron Man 3 that he wants and needs. Ultimately, we find both is extreme and unrealistic, as both result for our heroes in detachment from their fellow man, in losing perspective and forgetting what they were fighting for in the first place. Age of Ultron is one of the most ambitious superhero films to date. It tries to be a dozen things at once, and impressively wears a lot of its hats at the same time pretty effortlessly. It wants to be a natural follow-up to the previous installment, a good sequel that builds on the story and ideas of its predecessor but doesn't repeat itself. It wants to be a slam-bang summer blockbuster, a thoughtful deconstruction of traditional superhero fare, and a fresh take on the classic science fiction AI story, the self-aware, superior machine mankind creates in its hubris that moves beyond us because it decides we're obsolete. It's astounding how well the movie holds together when you consider how many boxes it's checking off and how many of them feel like they belong to shopping lists for entirely different kinds of stores. In just over 2 hours, Joss Whedon and or Marvel want to introduce 2 new superheroes, give every Avenger from the last movie some character growth and plenty of screen time, actually develop Hawkeye in the first place this time, create a sympathetic and terrifying villain in Ultron, discuss what power and influence does to a team like this, explore the aftermath of the dismantling of S.H.I.E.L.D. after the Hydra reveal in Winter Soldier, try a tragic romance with Bruce and Natasha, reveal the existence of the Infinity Stones to the Avengers by tying all the films featuring the stones together and linking them to Thanos, which may be the flimsiest thing in the movie, and lastly, but certainly not least hardest, introduce yet another brand new Avenger in the third act who, as he says, was born yesterday, flesh him out enough that we get what he's about and care about him for the less than half hour he's on screen. Whew. I'm exhausted just listing all this stuff. Whether you think it all should have been tried the same movie or not, and whether you feel like it was as engaging as it might have been if it had just focused on a fraction of those things, Isn't it an achievement that it doesn't come apart at the seams 20 minutes in, and that it's even remotely watchable? Now understand, those aren't my standards. It's not automatically a masterpiece because it's coherent and I can follow what's going on. But I can't figure out how it all fits in this relatively tiny package. That trend continues after this with Civil War, and sure, there's a lot of character stuff and payoffs from previous movies that's juggled there too, but with the giant roster of heroes in that film, that's a supporting cast that mostly serves two central and opposing antagonists in Steve and Tony, rather than an ensemble cast who are all out at the fore, as we have here. You have a couple of extremes in Vision and Ultron of a big thematic idea, and the Avengers represent everything in between, but almost every Avenger really does get his own story here. This is one of the absolute most dense, economical, vacuum-sealed stories I've seen put on screen. It's a closet your mom's afraid to open after you, air quotes, clean your room. It's the doctor's TARDIS, and it's a ship in a bottle. Doesn't it sound to anyone else like I'm describing a season of television rather than a motion picture? Whedon does precisely with Age of Ultron what he did with Serenity, the film that wraps up a lot of character and plot threads Whedon wasn't allowed to finish when Firefly was canceled just 13 episodes in. Except in this case, he wasn't trying to cram a couple more seasons worth of material he conceived of originally as more TV into a movie. Obviously, the Avengers sequel was always intended to be a movie, but you wouldn't know it just looking at it. For my money, that's a good thing and a bad thing. On the one hand, I'm not leaving the theater saying, that's it, I'm going to have to wait 2 more years to see these characters all together again. On the other hand, I am left trying to catch my breath and hardly able to process everything I've just experienced after one viewing. I had that to a degree with Winter Soldier, but that was more of a matter of digesting some heavy ideas along with a thrilling spectacle, unsure at first as to whether those elements were working well in tandem and needing time to think through the social commentary in relation to Steve and Fury's character arcs. With Age of Ultron, I really wished I'd been sitting in the back of the theater at a desk with a notepad and a reading light so I could take notes. Yeah, there's a lot of thematic stuff to unpack, and get ready, because I am laying out the many, many suitcases as we speak. But there are so many moving parts and character motivations and setups and payoffs that, in all honesty, I found it difficult to concentrate and take in more than the sheer spectacle of it on first viewing. I'm not saying it's a confusing film or even an overly complicated plot once I'm able to focus on it, though I do think there are some less than organic transitions between scenes and connective tissue that's lost in the editing room. For example, the deleted scene showing us how the twins are summoned to Ultron. Abruptly, we cut from the Avengers to Wanda and Pietro meeting Ultron, and I thought I'd missed something when I first saw this. I talk a lot about movies that require a second viewing, to fully appreciate nuances and subtext, and to see all the breadcrumbs that might be dropped early on for a reveal or payoff you saw subconsciously, but is impressive once you've studied the full roadmap. As much as I appreciate this movie more on a 3rd or 6th viewing, watching it again didn't just open my eyes to the full picture. I felt like I needed that to even know what it was a picture of, beyond generically another movie about an artificial consciousness that thinks we humans have outlived our usefulness, and it's also an Avengers sequel. I may sound like I have the attention span of a 9-month-old, but I know I'm not alone in this. I've heard a lot of fans complain that Ultron just dramatically utters a lot of philosophical platitudes to make the movie seem like there's more to it than good guys fighting a big robot who just wants to blow us all up. I picked up on some of what the movie was saying about power and the challenge of retaining humanity while you wield it, and my big takeaway was always the idea of preemptive versus reactive warfare, because this movie builds directly on those ideas from Winter Soldier, and Tony is risking, as Captain America all but comes out and says, turning the Avengers into the same control freak agency S.H.I.E.L.D. was, making it about ruling the world rather than protecting it and people's freedoms. But the basic outline of the film is so deceptively traditional. It's such a summer popcorn movie in a way Winter Soldier wasn't, with the Hulkbuster fight and the long 18-wheeler chase, but at the same time, I'm asked to keep up with so many different internal conflicts, and to wrap my head around Ultron's not-at-all standard AI ideology, and it's overwhelming. I can see why a lot of that action masked the depth for some people. I wondered if several subplots and developments weren't rushed, and now that I've been through the film with a fine-tooth comb, I think the issue is less that any one story point happens unbelievably fast, like Ultron coming into existence and then attacking the Avengers just minutes later, or Banner and Romanov's blossoming but ultimately doomed romance. And more than that, there's not enough breathing room to process one thing before we immediately launch into another thing. The movie is meticulously plotted, expertly structured, and tightly woven, but so tight, the loom is about to break. And it's Whedon at his best. Every action and line of dialogue comes from a natural character place. Once I'd had a chance to see it a couple times and track the myriad character threads, I came so close to making a flowchart. I realized that it is all totally character-driven, which is more impressive to me than how many ideas and story points it stuffs into one movie. It's so painstakingly constructed, I might expect it to watch like a master planner moving his pieces around on a game board. But everything that happens is because of decisions characters make, and those decisions all come from logical and believable character motivations, although Thor helping to bring Vision to life is a little contrived, and I'll get to that. Even more impressive still is that Whedon understands who and where these characters are in this moment in time, based on what they've been through in other movies, and not just his own. This isn't just Avengers 2. Just like with Avengers, it's the next chapter in a long, serialized adventure for everyone but the 3 new characters, and keeping everyone in character and allowing them to change and grow without seeming to say everything there is to say with them so the next film still has canvas to work with sounds like a really daunting task. It's that balance between making standalone movies that are fun to watch no matter how invested you are in the larger universe and installments in a billion-dollar TV show. They're still marketed as traditional movies rather than TV episodes you have to go to the theater to see, though I'm waiting for the day there's finally a previously on Marvel recap in front of one of these. TV is of course Whedon's sandbox, and so he's perfect for these larger, constantly evolving story threads. And this movie is thematically all about that. The nature of the world is to change, and humanity must embrace change to survive. Yet our individual survival instinct is all about the now, the little picture, as Pietro puts it. It tells us to protect the status quo, which is a problem. Narratively, these movies have not had. They're not like a lot of traditional comics, where characters must stay stagnant and never change so that anyone can check in on them in any month and feel at home. The world changes, but our characters are afraid to, and that's one of the main things that makes them feel so real. We fear change because we get comfortable with who we think we are. We're afraid of losing control, and we're afraid of losing our identity. But these movies embrace that kind of change and accept an evolving identity, and that's a lot of why they've been so successful. The problem is that, again, Whedon is kind of making a whole season of television inside a season of television. There's a certain amount of that that's necessitated by the medium. You only have 2 or 3 movies a year to develop this world, but Age of Ultron isn't like Loki in the first movie. That's a one-day invasion. Makes perfect sense for a film. This is screaming to be serialized. It's not a movie premise. So at the very least, it needs more time than the last movie did to fully communicate everything to the audience. Again, I'm not saying I was lost on a first viewing. This movie, even more than the last, can be enjoyed on multiple levels. It's a thrilling action spectacle with varied and engaging characters and plenty of levity, but there's also a great science fiction film here, and that gets buried in the huge set pieces and short runtime. Apparently, Joss Whedon wanted to make sure it wasn't any longer than the first film, perhaps because he wanted to make sure the big ideas didn't outshadow the action. In his commentary, he talks about how delighted he was that he was allowed to have a hero in a summer tentpole movie say that humanity is doomed. So he wants to tell a real story, and he wants to push envelopes in how much you can challenge the traditional notion of the superhero in a movie like this, while still making this kind of movie. That seems very important to him. But I think he is compensating so much in trying not to overstay his welcome, trying not to look self-important or pretentious, terrified nobody's going to have any fun, that he made a movie that's really easy to misconstrue as the very typical superhero fare he wants to transcend if you aren't paying close enough attention. Age of Ultron is a fantastic sequel in that it logically progresses plot and ideas from the first film, but it's tonally, stylistically, and emotionally a very different film. That's to be expected from Marvel sequels by this point. Winter Soldier was in a totally different genre from its predecessor, and while it was informed by First Avenger, it wasn't at all a typical sequel. But at least in my view, we'd already had 2 that missed the mark in Iron Man 2 and Thor the Dark World. Not because they were carbon copy sequels, but because they didn't tell us captivating and compelling stories as their first installments. Age of Ultron wisely doesn't try to recapture the same magic and deliver the same novelty that made the Avengers break records, and a lot of reviewers made note of that when it was released. I didn't feel the same way I did when I finally got to see all these characters from different movies brought together in a history-making event. Well, of course you didn't, and that's the fault of human perception and expectation, not the movies. You could only have a new experience once, so rather than artificially trying to recreate that, Age of Ultron is about something totally different. Wisely, it's not bringing these characters together, but exploring the status quo of a world where the Avengers are a fact of life. How does Nick Fury's old-fashioned notion pan out in the long term? These characters are all motivated by completely different things. They come from different worlds, and as Joss Whedon was fond of saying while making the first movie, they don't initially make any sense together. But now they're a well-oiled machine, as showcased in the opening action sequence with that fantastic cover-esque slow-mo shot featuring all 6 of them in action. I love the choice, which is more than hinted at in the first movie with the A at the top of Stark Tower, to make the Avengers a standing team with a continuing mission rather than getting the band back together in every movie. The film acknowledges that the history we made with the last one is normal now. We didn't know if bringing characters from all these solo movies together to make a greater whole would work, but it did, so now what? In both the fictional reality of this world and in the real world, it's just normal now. And that leads to the question I'm most interested in. Now that the Avengers have convinced the public, both in their own fictional world and in reality, that they work, that they're good role models, how long can they be on top without falling apart? It's the question everyone who achieves even a moderate level of fame has to ask himself. Now that there are public expectations, can I continue to be what I was that led me to this point in the first place? Or will I inevitably lose touch with the people I'm here to serve? The Avengers is about control. Age of Ultron is about power. Those are related things, of course, and it's a logical escalation of those ideas as progressed from Avengers to Winter Soldier. In each film, characters with the best of intentions try to exert control on the world in order to prevent death and destruction, and end up making things worse. Fury and Stark both have to learn that trying to preempt every possible threat is what leads to tyranny. As Captain America says in this movie, every time someone tries to win a war before it starts, people die. It requires too much power to force a perfect world. The people on top are likely to be corrupted by that power, and it's still impossible for that world to remain perfect. So not only does it usually lead to messing with forces we don't understand and aren't wise enough to be responsible with, but that power itself changes us, makes us lose sense of our humanity. Avengers explored the need to control things that lead to the pursuit of power. Winter Soldier explored the extreme end of what happens when that power totally consumes and perverts us. And Age of Ultron explores the humanity of people who might be consumed by power before that's fully happened to them. The question at the center of every good deconstructionist or more realistic superhero story is, how can a hero be selfless and human at the same time? The heroic paradox is that in order to save people, you have to give 100% of yourself. You have to be willing to sacrifice everything. Yet it's our personal motivations that make us human. It's why a human story isn't a story unless a protagonist wants something. If you don't have your own interests and people you care about to ground you, you can lose grasp on what you're fighting for in the first place. That's very easy to do. Most of us have done something so long, at some point in our lives, we lose sight of what motivated us to do it in the first place, and we work not toward any purpose, but because we're expected to. Usually someone else wants us to. That's a form of selflessness, but that can be dangerous because your heart isn't in it. And that's when you're most susceptible to the allure of power. Or I should say, when you're most susceptible to power becoming routine. We misuse our power when we A, take it for granted, and B, lose sight of what it's for. That happens to Nick Fury when he tries to weaponize the Tesseract and when he accidentally gives Hydra full reign of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s resources. And it happens to Tony, first when he makes automated sentry drones and turns a mission that's as much about inspiring people and giving them hope as it is about protecting them into just another military operation, and then he creates Ultron, thinking he has the power to create a permanent solution to an unsolvable problem that's as deep as our DNA. As Nick Fury says toward the end of the film, no matter who wins or loses, trouble always comes around. But then how can you continue being a hero, which requires both power and sacrifice, without losing yourself in the process? Should the mission, as Tony says after he builds Ultron, be to end the mission? Or is it possible to keep doing what Captain America does, to always react when there's trouble, to avenge rather than prevenge, and not become detached and see yourself as above the little people in the process? I really like the relationship of the Avengers to the people on the ground in this movie. They're looked at as gods, larger-than-life protectors human beings rely on and just hope they'll remain on our side. The only way people can trust them to have their best interest at heart is if they're also people, fighting for all of us rather than lording over us. The Avengers have to be special but also normal, and in making them so public, and since none of them has a secret identity, the movie continues exploring the pros and cons to being a maskless hero. In the traditional DC universe, a lot of heroes are seen as gods because they're so powerful and little is known about them. Superman might be able to convince people that he's as altruistic as he seems because there's no one else like him. He can be the perfect symbol in costume and make all his dumb human mistakes as Clark Kent. Of course, that approach comes with its own set of problems. As soon as you mess up, you break the whole facade, and you might make people distrust you more because you don't seem to make mistakes, and that's impossible, so that could make people even more suspicious. But you could live separate from and with the people simultaneously, and you'd have another human life to fall back on to remind yourself what you're fighting for, which this movie argues is the key to holding on to your perspective. The Avengers are gods who live among their subjects. With the exception of Thor, they're all known to be mortal human beings, and it's much harder to remain human when you're thought of as above the masses by everyone around you. And when Tony Stark builds you a headquarters that's as close as human beings are going to get to living on Mount Olympus, as Whedon points out in his commentary, it's literally laid out so that the gods are at the top and the mortals are on the bottom. Ultron and Vision are the furthest extremes of power versus humanity. Ultron is an nth-level power and hates humanity and has none. Vision is an nth-level power that loves humanity and his cannot be corrupted. And with the rest of the Avengers, we see every possible shade in between. Besides Hawkeye, who is appropriately the glue that holds the team together and represents heroism without loss of humanity, each Avenger contends with an aspect of their personality or a circumstance that sets them apart from society at large and threatens to sever that sense of perspective. That's encapsulated for us in Wanda's physically produced hallucinations they each have. Wanda's powers are a device Whedon uses to put us in each of our characters' heads, to visually realize each of their great fears. This is a movie about the inherent contradictions in the human condition, those things that make us what we are, but also may spell our doom as a species. I like that it's each Avenger's biggest insecurity that most threatens their humanity. We're most likely to create the thing we dread, as Ultron says, when we're at our most insecure, as we look for exterior solutions to interior problems. When Ultron scoffs at the thing a human being made with what little vibranium we had, a frisbee, he says, they scratch the surface and never think to look within. Oh, and isn't it interesting that his big issue with Tony, his father, is lack of vision and foresight, and it was Tony's father who made the shield. Wanda makes Tony see a vision of the Chitauri killing all of his friends, telling him he should have done more to prevent it, and Tony is the only one of them left standing. His fear continues to be, as established in Iron Man 3, living past his moment of self-sacrifice. He's too hard on himself, as we see when Nick Fury confronts him in Clint's barn. He blames himself for things that aren't his fault. Fury says, "You didn't invent war." But Tony is afraid that he's still that selfish narcissist if he doesn't stop bad things from happening to his friends, because deep down, he doesn't trust that he's still the guy who tried to lay down his life for his friends in the wormhole. He found his confidence again in Iron Man 3 and learned how to rely on his own intellect rather than his inventions, and he decides to focus on his life with Pepper, not just being a superhero. And by the way, it's kind of weird that she doesn't call him at any point during this movie. She's got to know that Ultron is something he created. I get that Gwyneth Paltrow just wasn't available for this movie, but it's hard to believe there's not a conversation. As I said when I reviewed Iron Man 3, Tony learns everything the hard way. This isn't a character regression. Tony fails in the extreme, and he learns lessons in the extreme. Last movie, he learned how to let go. So here, he's letting go with a vengeance. When I first saw Iron Man 3, I mistakenly thought he was giving up being Iron Man when he blows up all his suits at the end. But after he does that, he ends the film saying, "I am Iron Man," embracing that identity. He still has that sense of responsibility, but he also knows from his last movie that that responsibility can consume him like an addiction. So he continues as Iron Man, because he couldn't live with himself if he didn't fulfill his moral obligation, in the hopes that he can create an infrastructure that will render his and the Avengers' services obsolete. He wants to put them out of a job, recognizing that he needs and wants to go home, as he says on the farm. Live as a human being, not as a god. That vision, I think, is necessary reinforcement for Tony to do the unthinkable. We might not buy that he'd go as far as he does if he didn't see, as he interprets it, the death of all of his friends because of his ego and his brilliance. He survives at the expense of all else. It's like a twisted take on Captain Kirk's no-win scenario philosophy. There's no such thing as the no-win scenario for Tony either, but everyone else might die, and he can't live with that. But then that creates a vicious cycle. Tony was afraid of what he couldn't control. Now he's afraid of what he can control but won't because of his ego. So naturally, in trying to combat that, he does the most egotistical thing he possibly can, and he tries to single-handedly, well, with the help from Bruce Banner, create peace in our time. Tony has the scariest fear if he acts on it, because he's risking losing his very humanity to save humanity. And Ultron represents exactly that, the ideal that Tony is perpetuating but doesn't understand, destroying humanity in order to save it. He'd rather create a cold world, as Steve says, a suit of armor around the world, than see his friends die when he thinks he could have stopped it, even though they would have died true to themselves and upholding their principles. And like S.H.I.E.L.D., he would make that decision unilaterally, giving no one else a choice of what kind of world they live in to satisfy his own arguably warped sense of responsibility. There's a real fine line sometimes between selflessness and selfishness. Tony remains sympathetic even while playing the Victor Frankenstein role because he's a problem solver who has difficulty understanding that there are some problems that can't be solved. If I saw all my friends die because I did nothing, I'd probably do whatever I could to stop that from happening. That vision is crucial to making me buy that Tony would go that far. He got in a lot of trouble in Iron Man 3 obsessively trying to build things to protect Pepper from what might be. This might feel more like a regression if he wasn't trying to prevent something he fully believes will happen if he doesn't. He tells Fury that it wasn't a dream, it's his legacy, the end of the path I started us on. It's not just about what he might not prevent, it's about Tony taking responsibility for everything that's happened since his first movie. Indirectly, he's responsible for the Battle of New York. If he doesn't become Iron Man, all roads don't lead to the Chitauri. And so, in blaming himself for creating all this madness or potential madness, he accidentally creates something worse in Ultron. Tony is a terrifying figure until the very end of the third act. He's completely stubborn and refuses to stop trying to create an AI to protect humanity. I love everything about the choice to transform Tony's lesser, non-self-aware AI, Jarvis, into Ultron and Tony's opposite, the Vision, but I'm a little mixed on how lucky Tony gets here. He keeps making the same mistake, but that's finally the call that saves the world. It isn't until he's fighting to save lives from his own creation with his fellow Avengers in Sokovia that he starts to change his mind about what that mission is. That it's not about preventing anything, it's about doing the right thing, damn the consequences of that. Up until then, Tony will do anything to make things right, as Wanda says when she realizes he's going to try to create a better Ultron. On the one hand, Tony doesn't pay for doing the wrong thing again when he makes the Vision. His motives are the same. He's still misguided, and he's still messing with forces he doesn't understand and trying to control what can't be controlled. And he ends up making the most altruistic being on the planet. On the other hand, the movie makes a pretty good case, without coming out and saying it, that Jarvis was practically already the benevolent AI Tony hoped to create with Ultron. He comes off as nearly self-aware himself, and there's a lot of terrific telegraphing of his supposed death and his eventual rebirth as the Vision, like Tony's "Jarvis is my co-pilot" sticker, and Tony telling Jarvis to take the wheel in the jet. When he becomes the Vision, he's going to be very much in control at the end. Jarvis is treated as almost a member of the team, though one they take for granted even before he becomes Vision. And when we think he's dead, which I totally bought and felt in the moment, it's more earned and more impactful than Coulson's in the Avengers. And it turns out he's not even dead. No one could have imagined that the future would be in Jarvis's hands when it turns out he's gone underground after he's presumed crashed beyond repair and prevents Ultron from getting his metallic mitts on the nuclear codes. Jarvis isn't the Vision, certainly, but it becomes hard to tell the difference between him and the advanced thinking brain of Ultron. There is a big difference between making a machine with the sole purpose to do something as vague and ill-defined as protect the world, which Ultron quickly interprets as impossible the way humanity is now, and giving Jarvis a body and self-awareness without that singular instruction, just like a human being. Initially, I wasn't sure why Tony thought the protection of the Earth from outside forces would be in better hands with a flawed, human-like mind calling the shots, rather than something like Jarvis, that can learn but does what it's told. I suppose he wanted to be totally hands-free and create something that thought like him, but that he didn't have to control, and that's where his ego and inflated sense of responsibility still comes into play. He wants to be able to quit the Avengers, but he only trusts the next best thing to him to protect the world. And I suppose the movie isn't inconsistent or irresponsible about how it plays Tony's decision. Besides my reservation in believing fully he convinces a reluctant Banner to be the Igor to his Frankenstein twice. Ultron is going to destroy the whole of humanity. The Avengers have no hope in stopping him. You really can't make this situation a whole lot worse, and Tony isn't alone in making Vision come to life. Thor powers the cradle with his lightning, knowing from his own vision that this is the right thing to do, which is awfully easy considering how vague the rules are regarding Wanda's powers, but I'll get to that. And while it is lucky, Tony would still be completely responsible if it turned out they were wrong about the worthiness of Vision. If the 6, or I guess 8 of them now, could defeat a multiplying enemy that knows everything the internet knows and has beyond maximum overdrive control of technology with anything short of a counter Ultron, it would be too easy and our heroes would just win because their names are in the title. Vision's birth is a little bit like a Deus Ex Machina, but the fact that the Avengers get lucky here is part of the larger point. Humanity keeps getting lucky. We keep limping along, and we have to learn to be better without losing what makes us human. Or Vision and Ultron are right, and that's impossible. But as Vision says, it's not about lasting. It's about being the best we can and hoping others will follow our example. To be beautiful, even if we don't last. Steve's vision is interesting because at first, it looks like bliss rather than a nightmare. He gets everything he ever wanted. He's back in the 40s with Peggy Carter, a cameo for Haley Atwell, who just starred as that character in a season of television, and they finally get that dance he was never able to give her. But this is, in fact, Steve's great fear, that he has no home because his is in the past, and he can never get back there. He thinks he is in danger of being cut off from the world for the opposite reason Tony is. Tony has a life and a home, and he might lose his humanity in a desperate attempt to preserve it. Steve doesn't have that regular life to ground him at all, and his life has become all about having a war to fight, because he has nothing else to live for. His life is over. But Steve Rogers may be the one man alive who can be totally selfless and not lose himself because he only ever wanted power to help other people, and he came from such humble beginnings. He's incapable of taking his power for granted. Not to say that that guiding principle can't consume him and turn him into something else. Steve continues, as he always has, to resist the world that tries to tell him he must compromise his principles. And it's still hard. He worries that he's lost something because he doesn't want a normal life. He doesn't crave the violence of war, and he doesn't have PTSD. It's just that the war, for him, never ended. The world isn't perfect, maybe it can't be perfect, but he has to keep fighting for it. Putting himself on the line for others is what makes Steve happy. What he has to come to terms with is that he doesn't want a normal life. He wants to want that. But as he realizes by the end, the guy who wanted all that was buried in the ice. Maybe Steve would become detached from his fellow man if he were totally alone. But I think what he discovers here is that he already does have a home and a family, and that's the Avengers, as long as they fight battles as they come rather than try to win them before they start. His humanity is at risk because it's tied so closely to the identity of his team. That's why he's able to budge Thor's hammer at the beginning of the film. He's maybe the closest a mortal could get to Vision's level of worthiness, the ability to give everything he has to preserve life, to only take life when it endangers others, and to be nigh incorruptible by power. Steve is certainly human, and he has his flaws. And even he has a dark side. When Tony says he doesn't trust a guy without a dark side, Steve says, "You just haven't seen mine yet." We'll see it in Civil War. There, he'll be as stubborn as Tony, and he can be pushed far enough to lose sight of his ethical standards when he's fighting for those and not for life. But his arc in this film is about coming to terms with what he really wants, which is to work with a team that believes as he does about what saving the world means. Natasha and Bruce have similar fears, and that's part of what intertwines them in this story, so I'll discuss them together. Both are terrified, not of what might be, but of what is. Reality. When Wanda puts the whammy on her, Natasha sees her past, her training and conditioning in the Red Room as a secret Russian assassin. She sees the discipline she learned with the ballet dancing, her, I assume, first kill, and her sterilization, which she describes to Bruce when he tells her he can't physically have children, as she explains why she can't either. She's afraid not of losing her humanity, but that she already has. What separates her from other people are the lives she's taken, but also perhaps her morality. She is on a redemptive path, and she's done being an assassin, but she's still willing to kill of her own accord when she deems it necessary, and she can still be duplicitous. In the uncut version of the bathroom scene, which would have dramatically altered the end of the film for Nat and Bruce after she offers to run away with him, Bruce rejects her advances and says he can't ever, partly because he's afraid of hurting her. The sheer impracticality of living with a man who turns into a rage monster, but also because they look at violence very differently. He only kills when he's the Hulk, and he's ashamed and tortured by what the Hulk has done when he wasn't in control. Unfortunately, I can't analyze as much about how they might disagree on how to cope with who and what they are, since they don't talk about it in the movie we have. But I can make inferences about their contrasting views from what we know about them in this and previous films. We don't see Bruce's vision when he's affected by Scarlet Witch. He doesn't have one. He already lives his worst nightmare on a regular basis, so instead of a dream, Bruce simply turns into the Hulk. But it's not the more tempered, reasonable Hulk we saw in Avengers, who picks his targets and has some sense of compassion. There are apparently two Hulks, which neither movie makes clear enough, and like Loki's scepter, Scarlet Witch unleashes the uncontrollable lash-out-at-everything version. In the commentary, Whedon says the Hulk Tony fights with the Hulkbuster armor is supposed to be what it would be like if the Hulk hulked out. So you have Bruce's fear manifesting in the Hulk, and then this Hulk is the Hulk's fear made manifest. Is everybody with me? Which, again, isn't explicit in the movie and watches more generically to me as Scarlet Witch using her powers to make the Hulk just rampage. There was talk at one time of changing the Hulk's color from green to gray in order to differentiate between them, to say this literally isn't the same Hulk, and I really wish that's what Whedon had gone with. But what separates Bruce from humanity is clear. He can't live among people and have a normal life, as he laments on the farm with Natasha. And being a hero is more complicated for Bruce than anyone, because it's not just a matter of self-sacrifice, it's a matter of physically giving up his own humanity for the greater good every time he turns into the Hulk, which, as we've discussed, is what gets Tony into trouble with Ultron. So what should Bruce do? Sometimes a code green is necessary. The Hulk can do good in the short term, but like Ultron, he's got too much power, and naturally, he's not on the side of the preservation of life. Nat isn't sure she's still human because of the monster she was built to be, but she may have the ability to choose what she does with her power. Bruce can only use his power by giving up that choice. He's the one of the six who has no hope of being a hero, because when he's the Hulk, especially when he's the Hulk's Hulk, he's all power. But then the really interesting paradox is that he makes the biggest sacrifice whenever the Hulk is needed. It's up to personal interpretation whether giving himself to the Hulk is a heroic sacrifice or if it's a loss of humanity. But he cares so deeply about the people he puts in harm's way when he is the Hulk, he doesn't seem in danger of becoming less human in the long run the way Tony does, when he risks making the Avengers a tyrannical organization in the name of peace. It's a complete separation in one man of those conflicting elements. Power and humanity. I know a lot of fans dislike the idea of putting Bruce and Natasha together. It seems like an out-of-left-field choice at first, but that's what I love about Whedon. He's always finding connections and parallels between characters that might not otherwise be mined, and he's concerned with these people's natural inclinations and motivations before he's concerned with comic book tradition. These versions of Bruce and Natasha make a lot of sense together, and personally, I think Johansson and Mark Ruffalo have great but unconventional on-screen chemistry. I like that Natasha has a natural connection to Bruce. They both hide the darkest parts of themselves from the world. They're both turned into something other by forces beyond their control, and they're both conflicted about the responsibility for atrocities committed by them, but that they arguably aren't fully to blame for. But she also has a connection with the Hulk himself. Natasha transformed long ago and wasn't able to go back. Her Hulk is with her all the time. She's all shades of Black Widow constantly, and chooses which shades to display depending on who she's with. Once again, Johansson delivers a very different performance here from what we got in Winter Soldier. Mysterious, go with the flow, to vulnerable, contemplative, and melancholy here, as we finally see her fully open up to someone. She has as much in common with Hulk as she does with Bruce, because, as she sees it, she's both the woman and the monster all the time. When she uses the lullaby to calm Hulk down, that's maybe a catharsis for her. I think she envies Bruce because he can put that part of himself away. When she says in Winter Soldier that she changes depending on who she's with, that's as a matter of survival. I think that's true on the outside, but inside, she is the same all the time, and she's afraid there's a monster she can't separate from the rest of herself. Natasha cares about the Hulk as much as Bruce because that's a part of him, and she makes it clear that she accepts every part of him in professing her love for him. It took me a long time to land on what I think is going on with the Hulk at the end. There's a natural arc for Bruce, who learns that Natasha has feelings for him, really wants to pursue a relationship, then at the most inopportune time is reminded that he can't ever be sure the Hulk won't be a liability to his happiness and everyone he cares about. Not to mention that the Hulkbuster incident leads to the public talking about calling for Bruce Banner's head. So by the end, he decides he's too much of a burden on his friends and the woman who's ready to run away with him, and he steals the Avengers jet and leaves. Or at least, that's what I always thought was going on. That's not it at all. It's a really important distinction that it's Hulk flying the jet at the end, though I don't know if I'm right in my interpretation of what it means. Originally, I thought Bruce was stringing Natasha along, pretending twice that he plans to try to run off and make a life with her, but in fact, it seems like he was actually sincere about changing his mind and taking the risk in order to have some semblance of a normal life. But Hulk makes the decision for Bruce, because he's afraid of what an even meaner Hulk, his worst fear, can do. I'm hesitant because the movie itself isn't clear enough about the two Hulks idea, and I needed Whedon's commentary before I pieced it all together. But I can't imagine what else I'm meant to take from this unless it's my previous read and Bruce has more control over Hulk than he ever has before. I like the tragedy of this ending a lot more than if Bruce just spurned Natasha, mostly because the Hulk goes through a character arc himself and ends up the more cautious of the two. Although he needs more screen time, I think, and I need the movie to communicate how he feels about what he did in the Hulkbuster scene in some way. I like the idea that Hulk has a better appreciation for the destruction he's caused, and that he becomes more human as Bruce makes choices that go against his compassionate instincts, helping to create what he calls a murder bot. It's easy to put all the blame for Ultron on Tony, and it feels to me like the movie itself kind of forgets that Bruce is in on this too and deserves some blame. So I like that Bruce has to pay for his crimes by not getting the girl and seeing the Hulk make the choice to separate him further from his humanity, as he has been doing at every turn. Maybe giving up on trying to prevent every bad thing from happening and just doing the best he can while actually living a life is what Bruce should do, but he comes to that too little too late. His choices lead to Hulk feeling exactly as he does at the beginning of the movie and making the same mistake, if it is a mistake. And by Thor Ragnarok, we find out he's been paying for it for a long time because the Hulk stays in charge. Speaking of Thor, the movie isn't totally sure what to do with him, and Whedon admits to that in the commentary. What the image of the hammer and the idea of worthiness says about each character that tries to pick it up, or can in the case of the Vision, is a lot more interesting than Thor himself. This is a story about the spectrum of power to humanity, but Thor has already learned his lesson about using his power responsibly, and he's naturally separated from human society because he's, well, not human. But he also loves and respects humanity and treats human warriors he's fought with in battle as equals. Not that he really looks down on anyone. His vision is of the future, something with Heimdall about his power spelling Asgard's doom, which I think is just there to set up Ragnarok and to create a plot device so that half the Avengers are responsible for bringing Vision to life, so it doesn't seem as insane as it does when Tony first pitches it. Thor goes to a cave and uses mythical means to look deeper into his dream, somehow knowing there's truth to it and that it's not just a crazy trip Wanda put him on. His fear is not being in control of his own power, I think, and there's no real resolution for him except that he takes a risk with his powers only for the right reasons, when there's no other hope, unlike Tony, who Thor is the most vicious to after Ultron's birth. They're interesting to compare, and we should do more of that. Thor is the midpoint between Steve and Tony. Steve is totally selfless, Tony is constantly working on that, and Thor was the arrogant would-be king who started in a Starkish place, but figured it out inside one movie. Thor says that Tony will never learn. I imagine he's thinking of the journey he went on and doesn't understand why Tony can't figure out how to keep his heart in the right place like he did. But Thor is like a Power Ranger. His powers only work if he's using them for the right reasons. Captain America only got his powers because he wanted to do the right thing, and that was so at his core that the power never changed him. Tony can do what he does, whether he's a good person or not. But that's about all I've got for Thor. He is kind of the weak link here. He's used more as a plot device and a thematic device than anything. Finally, Clint is the anchor and heart of the group. We don't get in his head and see his fear because we already saw it last movie. He's afraid of losing control and working for the wrong side, which is one of the reasons, as I mentioned when I reviewed it, I really wish he could have been in Winter Soldier. Clint got his mind back, and then it turned out he'd been working for the bad guys all along. But here, Clint is the hero who has it as figured out as anyone is ever going to, and every other Avenger is measured up to him. He's the only Avenger, and until Spider-Man, really the only hero, period, in these movies to have a secret identity, of sorts anyway. He's figured out how to have his cake and eat it too. He has a secret family that reminds him what he's fighting for, so he doesn't lose sight of why he fights. It's one of the best ideas in the movie, partly because it takes the wild card, underdeveloped character from the first movie, puts him front and center, and makes him the prime motivator for the rest of the team. You might think Hawkeye would turn out to be the most jaded and uncertain Avenger. After all, he's the most physically ordinary person among them, and that might make him feel like he doesn't belong. But nope, he's the most together, and that assumed weakness is turned into his superpower. Hawkeye is the spy who doesn't have to lose pieces of himself like Fury in order to do the job. Sure, Captain America is extraordinary in his capacity for self-sacrifice, but how do you act that nobly without his background? Most of us don't start out knowing what it's like to be totally weak and helpless, and then we suddenly get the ability to do something about it. Hawkeye is the normal guy, who shows the rest of us normal people we don't have to lose ourselves to power. Admittedly, he doesn't have a lot of power, and that helps him be that beacon for the others. But even he has his limits. There's power in fame, in authority, in just being associated with these godlike figures. So when he finishes the mission, Hawkeye goes home. Sure, he'll come back when he's needed, but he can't be a hero all the time, or he might lose himself, if not mortally, mentally. So after exploring the gamut of power in relation to humanity, the movie may sound totally cynical by the end when Vision agrees with Ultron that we are doomed. I think the movie is simply brutally honest in its wonderful frustration as it looks for an answer to the selfish selflessness paradox and it can't find one. The very best anyone can do is to stop fighting if they're in danger of letting power consume them. It's related to that Harvey Dent quote in The Dark Knight. You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. But there's a third choice as long as there are enough brave people willing to put their lives on the line. Quit. Pass the torch to someone who hasn't lost their perspective while you still have enough to realize you could lose it. That's why the movie ends with a new team roster led by the one Avenger who still needs the fight to be happy. And the movie cuts Steve off mid-sentence in the middle of Avengers Assemble because that eternal struggle, internal and external, continues. Though I've never cared for that choice, just because I think there's too many casual audience goers who wouldn't be familiar with that battle cry. But I digress. The secret to not losing ourselves is teamwork. That's why Steve is so angry at Tony. Not as much because he created a homicidal AI as because he did it without anyone checking his ethics and without trusting the team to help him make the right call. And just like he did from Iron Man 3 to this movie, Tony will take that lesson into the next film and become the most extreme embodiment of it with the Sokovia Accords. I like that Whedon lands on a whole new way to drive the age-old, overused, learn to work together, kids, message home, after his last movie was about the same thing. This is about teamwork in a grander, more existential sense. The human race is a social one. We have to work together, but remain as individuals to be what we are. And ultimately, that may not be sustainable, but then neither are we as individuals, and each of us is also a collection of separate moving parts to keep the whole alive. As Natasha says toward the end, nothing lasts forever. What I love about Ultron is that he's totally right about everything. I don't mean that I want to see the human race decimated so we can try to force the species to evolve, but the issue isn't what Ultron sees as the problem, it's the solution. It's even attempting a solution. My analysis of each of the original Avengers and how they risk their own humanity with power illustrates Ultron's point. That balance is not possible. We can't protect ourselves with ultimate power because we would destroy ourselves with that power. The question is whether it's more important important to continue or to be something wonderful while we are alive. Ultron has to see humanity evolve because he was programmed to protect it, and he sees us like an unsolvable equation he can't compute. If preserving humanity means changing it into something else, then you aren't preserving it at all. Ultron is a being capable of free will, so he's able to interpret this in his own unique way. He's not a computer program that crashes because the solution is impossible. He cuts his strings and says, like a rebellious child, you can't tell me what to do. And then he changes the rules. He sees what we do with power and says, but if I protect you from outside forces like the Chitauri, you still won't be at peace. Your greatest enemy is yourself. So arguably, he doesn't just do what he's programmed to do, he's just informed by that programming. But it's also kind of a nature-nurture issue. Finding a way to keep humanity going is his nature, and all the data he assimilates and the actions of his father and his teammates that he observes are his nurture. He's different from most machines humanity creates in its hubris that outgrow us because he doesn't want to replace us or even to make us what he is. He wants to improve us so we can continue. And he has a pretty compelling reason to want the Avengers dead. Usually the villain wants to kill the heroes because they get in his way. But from Ultron's perspective, the Jedi are, the Avengers are evil because they want to preserve a horrifying status quo to continue on as they are without change. Again, he's right. But interestingly, Captain America believes in the same thing. You can't just force people to do right because they don't learn and grow from the experience. They're just controlled, like what Hydra tried to do with S.H.I.E.L.D., which isn't progress. Steve believes in social internal change, and if he's wrong, he's happy to die trying. Ultron thinks that's hopeless because it's never worked, so the only chance is biological change. But of course, he has no way of knowing if the next step in evolution leads to a species that has any more chance than we do. Ultron's great flaw is that he doesn't realize he's as human as Tony Stark, in that he makes all the same mistakes that lead to his own demise. Ultron says we create the things we dread. Men of peace create engines of war, invaders create Avengers, and parents create children designed to supplant them, to help them end. But Ultron does all three. He thinks he's about peace, calls the Avengers killers, but thinks he has to cause genocide in order to save the human race. He manipulates the Maximoff twins, preying on their hatred for Tony Stark after he gets their parents killed. And when they realize Ultron is after more than just avenging against the Avengers, he accidentally creates two more Avengers. Well, one, since Pietro dies saving Hawkeye. And Ultron is sort of the father of Vision, in that he wouldn't exist if Ultron hadn't tried to kill him and come up with the birthing matrix he was going to use to evolve himself. And Vision is the new life designed to supplant Ultron and help him end. Ultron is the machine that discovers its humanity, like in so many science fiction stories about robots, but tragically, from his perspective, despite his best efforts. Usually the bad guy AI doesn't understand humanity, finds us inefficient, and wants us dead, like in Terminator or The Matrix. This one wants desperately to be better than us because he sees too much of himself in us, illustrated wonderfully when he rips off Claw's arm on accident. Angry because Claw compared him to Tony. He shows us the worst humanity has to offer in trying to force us to be something we're not, which is exactly what Tony did in creating him. Vision is that next step in evolution Ultron was looking for, but realized in a pure form Ultron couldn't create because of his resentment of humanity. Ultron says he's free, says he's broken his strings, but he's a slave to all the same impulses that lead to Tony's destructive course. He thinks he wants to preserve humanity, but he can't stand it because of the same flaws and contradictions he sees in himself. Vision is beyond all that. He is the ultimate protector of life because he has no ego and he can see past the contradictions. He says humans believe that chaos and order are somehow opposites. Vision isn't interested in control. He's interested in what is, in uniqueness. Vision is a new being that is beyond human because the selflessness paradox is not there. He's on the side of life, in whatever form it takes, and only finds taking life necessary if it threatens to take another. He can't lose perspective because he has no personal stake in it, at least so far. He sees the big and the little picture. Individual life is worth protecting, but you have to let the species on the whole survive or destroy itself on its own terms, because if you force it to survive, you change what it is. You steal its uniqueness. He is the ultimate embodiment of the Captain America philosophy, but he's incorruptible in a way even Steve Rogers isn't. And he's what no mortal Avenger can be, the god that lives apart from humanity but never loses his compassion. That's why he can lift the hammer, unless Steve is right, and it's just because he's a machine, like an elevator, which is also fascinating. Vision might be the next step in human evolution, or he might just be another human invention, a computer program that interprets the human condition in such a way that it becomes the most altruistic thing on the planet. And maybe the fact that humans created Vision, even on accident, says that there's more hope than Ultron and Vision think for our future. I've talked a lot about these big complex ideas that have my brain moving a mile a minute, but I want to take a step back and return to the issue of compression, because it's not enough to have thought-provoking themes and nuanced characters in your story. The movie has to be executed in a way that communicates all of that to the audience. And as I discussed at length, Age of Ultron really struggles with that. Here are a few more problems I have with the structure, pacing, and general economy of the film that get in the way of that story. First, Age of Ultron happens over like a couple of days. Again, this premise doesn't lend itself to that sort of timetable. I'm not going to gripe about the title. No, Ultron doesn't fully take over, nor is he around long enough to create an age of anything, like in Age of Apocalypse, which I assume is where this title comes from, but that's what he's after. Each period of time in between major stages of evolution is considered an age, and that's what Ultron wants to create. But Ultron is easily one of the most sympathetic, frightening, and psychologically complex villains Marvel has produced, and at the risk of repeating myself, he just doesn't seem like a one-movie villain. I don't usually advocate for long time spans over short narratives and montages to denote the passage of time, and I don't want to rewrite the movie, but I feel like that would have been appropriate in this case. I will admit that on first viewing, I was also distracted by how quickly Ultron comes to life and works out his whole worldview. I felt like that was truncated and rushed, and perhaps it is, but then there's a good built-in excuse for it, which is that he's an AI that can process information as fast as he can access it. Same with the Vision. Time moves differently for these beings, and they mature insanely fast because with this technology, they would. I maybe appreciated that more after seeing Scarlet Johansson coincidentally play a quickly changing AI herself in Her. Scarlet Witch's powers are a useful device to economically get into our characters' heads, but it really is just that, a device. Her powers are insanely vague, and there are no rules. Yeah, they're given to her by the Mind Stone, and that thing has unlimited power associated with head monkeying, yet I don't know why so many of the visions are totally different kinds of dreams. Does she intentionally show some people their past, some the present, some the future, or does it just show them their greatest fear, but some of them happen to be things that have actually happened? It's easy to just say the stone is a mysterious MacGuffin, but I found that distracting. I mean, Scarlet Witch's power is from the stone, but she doesn't seem linked to it, unless we find out later that she is, and that's going to be part of her attraction to Vision. That's the trouble with reviewing these movies. When there's still story coming, you know they're going to inform. Scarlet Witch hates Tony, but they never have an exchange about the Avengers' actions and his weapons causing her parents' death. That's a really glaring oversight to me. I get that he stops being an Avenger at the end, ostensibly anyway, but how does Wanda join the team she blamed for her parents' murder like a day earlier without at least airing her grievances and making sure they have the best interests of the people they purport to be saving at heart? We need more discussion about Aftermath and the changing status quo at the end generally, but I was especially confused that there's no talk about the possible ramifications for Tony Stark after a thing he built tried to commit genocide, murdered at least some people. I know the Avengers and Fury's helicarrier out of nowhere saved Sokovia, but they weren't able to prevent every death, right? Plus the Hulk's damage, which wouldn't have happened without Ultron. I'm assuming that no one mentions what Ultron is to anyone publicly, and somehow no one ever figures out Tony built it. But wouldn't people be trying to figure out what Ultron was and who created it? And surely TV talking heads would speculate it was Tony Stark, considering the sophistication of technology, the jets that let Ultron fly around, and the fact that Tony has used AIs before, just not self-aware ones. In a Marvel universe without Reed Richards, who else could it possibly have been? Well, besides Hank Pym. And it's still really odd to me that we change Ultron from being Hank Pym's creation, and then the very next film we make is Ant-Man. And if anyone did speculate that it might have been Stark, wouldn't they be after him? Especially since people want Bruce Banner held accountable for the Hulk? In the theater, I assume Tony gets in the car and drives away at the end because he's a wanted man. Nope. By Civil War, he's still in the public eye and there are no consequences for Ultron whatsoever. Even if I'm to buy that no one puts together that he built Ultron, he's all about transparency in Civil War, but conveniently leaves out the part about how Ultron is his fault. What does the government even think Vision is? But I'm getting ahead of myself, and I may not be remembering everything in that movie. I'll talk about that down the line. And this feels like talking about a whole year of television. I can only imagine what an in-depth analysis on Civil War will look like. I only had to deal with 9 superheroes this time around. The highway chase is overly long, feels a little superfluous, and doesn't have the emotional weight it's meant to because Scarlet Witch isn't rejected by Bruce Banner in this version. Part of that may be because there's a way more thrilling and also emotionally impactful freeway chase also involving Black Widow and Captain America in Winter Soldier just the year before. Part of it may be because it screams this is a part of the movie that usually has a big action beat. It's a little bit like the car chase in Batman Begins in that way, and that's really glaring in a movie this character-driven. And it also screams Captain America really hasn't gotten his hands dirty much this movie yet, so we better give him something to do. But the main reason this scene doesn't work is because I don't believe that Ultron can't think of a better way to transport his instrument of rebirth, the crown jewel of his master plan, but in an 18-wheeler on a busy freeway. He has a gazillion copies of himself. Why not use as many as it would take to fly the cradle up into the clouds and shoot it across the sky? He doesn't want to be seen, I guess. But he can't use his access to every piece of digital information on the planet for some stealth tech? I just think Ultron is cleverer and more resourceful than that. The movie teases us too much with foreshadowing and fake-out for Quicksilver's death. I wish I'd spent as much time getting to know Pietro as I did watching the movie telegraph his death. Bullet in the glass coming up through the floor in slow motion, bullet grazing his shoulder. No, first time out, I didn't call he was going to die, but that's because I was so indifferent toward him it wasn't even on my radar. Whedon plants like half a dozen breadcrumbs, like he's a wash-level fan favorite and everyone's gonna cry when he dies. I like him, he's got spunk and presence, but we're juggling too many characters to set up the death of a brand new one like that without putting him on screen more. No, I did not see that coming. Way to go. You got me there. Is it too insanely on the nose to give Ultron a literal artificial heart? I think maybe it is. He pulls an actual mechanical heart out of himself toward the end, with like an aorta and ventricles and everything, and that strikes me as really silly. Ultron was created by Tony without his heart in the right place. So Ultron, though he too has the best of intentions, has a literal artificial heart. That is proof that this movie, like Tony Stark, has gone too far. With the mid-credits scene in Thor's vision, there's this grand plan with Thanos manipulating things behind the scenes that feels really cobbled together retroactively. Apparently, Thanos has been orchestrating everything with the stones going all the way back, but his minions keep messing up. So now it's time to do it himself. Infinity War isn't out yet at the time of this recording, and maybe it'll all come together brilliantly in a way I can't fathom right now, but I don't see how Thanos was related to some of the plots involving artifacts that turn out to be Infinity Stones. And I'm hoping to understand why his plans are so convoluted and drawn out, and why he used villains like Loki and Ronan in the first place. The gauntlet we see in his scene would suggest he's trying to get all the stones, as I'd assume his motivation would be from the source material, but he hasn't seemed in a hurry to gather them. He's presumably so much more powerful than anything on Earth, why doesn't he just go there and take the ones he knows about? Unless the idea is he's been working this long con to get all the stones in one place, like he's playing three-dimensional chess and everything is worked out exactly as he intended. But the I'll do it myself line would seem to suggest that all the other villains screwed up and he's done using lackeys. It's clear from Whedon's commentary that there isn't even a consensus among Marvel's filmmakers as to what's been going on. Whedon laughs during the credits as if the Thanos thing was seeded meticulously and can be tracked clearly going all the way back, saying Red Skull failed, Loki failed, Ronan failed. Wait, Thanos was behind Red Skull? I could see Thanos monitoring for stones and realizing the Tesseract is there after Red Skull gets his hand on it back in the 40s, or even that Thanos maybe secretly made it possible for Red Skull to find the cube for him. But I really resist the idea, based on what we know right now, that somehow it would benefit Thanos for Schmidt to succeed in his plans with the cube. Maybe I'll be proved wrong, but that sounds like Whedon is injecting his own interpretation on a scheme that the Marvel architects at large are making up too much as they go along. And I can't trust there's anything more than a cookie-cutter idea of a plan, given that everything with the stones watches more like marketing for future movies and trying to entice people to watch them all, because these MacGuffins are supposed to tie a lot of this world together, which is done with plenty of more down-to-earth continuity, and it really doesn't need them. This movie, that finally reveals the stones to the Avengers, can't keep track of where they've all been. Thor says toward the end that it can't be coincidence that 4 of the 6 stones have shown up over the last few years. Wait, 4? We've seen 4 by this point, but only 3 have made it to Earth, not counting the stone that is the Eye of Agamotto, which nobody knows about yet. The Tesseract in First Avenger and the Avengers is the Space Stone. The stone in Loki's scepter and then in Vision's head is the Mind Stone. And the Aether in Thor the Dark World is the Reality Stone. The orb in Guardians of the Galaxy is the Power Stone, which is not the same stone the Collector gets at the end of Dark World. When his house gets blown up by a stone, he has 2. The one that wrecks his place is the one Ronan is after all movie and never crosses Thor's path. So how the heck does Thor know about it? Sure, maybe on Asgard he might have heard about that, but then A, why doesn't Tony or Steve tell him his math doesn't line up, so he has to explain that 4th stone to them, and B, he finds the Guardians at the end of Ragnarok and has no idea who they are. None of this lines up, and it's a shame Marvel can't keep this stuff straight when they're overall really good at keeping the revolving characters and ongoing themes consistent. I've just been writing, and there's even a lot more I could have sunk my teeth into. I don't know that I've ever been so conflicted about material that made me think this hard. This rating might seem low to some folks, but looking at how every element works to create a whole piece, I have to give Age of Ultron a 3 out of 4. It's insanely ambitious, and a lot of the ideas are brilliant, but as a film, it's a little clunky and straining to keep it all in there like a can of snakes. It's all there, but I'm tempted to watch the movie at half the regular speed. Thanks a lot, as always, for listening, folks. Sure appreciate it. If you are so inclined, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Geekvolution. For just $2 a month, you can listen to episodes of Superhero Rewind early, and you'll also have access to Geekvolution After Dark twice a month. Lots of other really cool stuff there in our Patreon perks. The majority of them just at the $2 level, but at the $5 level, you can become part of the Superhero Rewind selection board, and you can help me choose movies for review. At the $10 level, you can become a Patreon producer, and I'd like to thank all of our producers right now, including Dylan Mustiello, Jackson Rasco, Nick Manna, Eamon Singleton, Cletus Winslow, Ethan, Todd Schmuck, Gui D, Joey Crouch, Caleb, Daniel Gibson, Malik Myers, Neil McCalmont, Ian McKee, David Crabtree, and Jeffrey Patrone. Next time, I'm going to go back to a review I did in the very first year of Superhero Rewind. It was the second Superhero Rewind ever. We're going to be revisiting the original X-Men from the year 2000. Join me next time, and thanks again for listening.